So, a concept I touched briefly upon is the idea of age categories in video games. Basically, games become kind of a super category. They're not really one thing anymore, they contain multitudes, many different experiences, and a big part of that is when you were born. The kind of age category you fit into has a big effect on what the landscape looks like for you, what you even think of when someone brings up the idea of video games. So I want to go just a little bit more in depth on that today. This is the kind of thing that could be an ongoing project or it could be a one-time thing. It's going to depend on the response I get from you, the viewer. This is based on an article I am working on for Superjump. I will have a link to that down in the description, and I do hope you read that because it will have a little bit more detail. This is kind of me just going off the cuff as I work on this thing. So a few sort of caveats, sort of notes as I go into this. First off, this does refer to the experiences of people in North America, more or less, specifically the US. If you're from a different region, your own experiences, your age categories are going to be different. I would love to see more articles, videos, whatever, addressing this from different regions of the world, from different countries, because clearly people in different places had very different experiences, and these age gaps may be even more extreme, more severe in different places. Second, this is, as you're going to see once we get into this, I'm addressing this in the broadest terms possible. The idea here is to create kind of a typology of what people who are born at different points consider the sort of basics of video games, what to them is normal. And that's going to encompass a wide range. I know there are going to be a lot of people out there who don't quite fall into these categories because maybe they were early adopters or maybe they were behind the times, because it's not just on a global sense. Even inside the US, this is going to change a lot depending on where you were, perhaps your family's socioeconomic status, things of that nature, geography. I grew up in the middle of nowhere, so I know things took a little longer to reach us. To that end, you will notice that my age categories, in many places they overlap. There's a lot of areas where there's a 2 or 3 year space where a person could be born who falls into more than one of these categories. That is intentional. I hate the entire concept of these like hard generational clefts. The idea that if you're born 2 years apart, you have completely different experiences. It's absurd. And the way I'm kind of trying to work around that here is that there are these kind of transitional phases. I am especially interested in hearing people who may have been born in one of those transitional phases. What was it like for you? Do you consider yourself to be kind of more on one side than the other, or are you somewhere in the middle? As I said, I'm hoping to get some feedback on this because this might be an ongoing project or it might be a one-time thing. But enough of me gabbing around. Let's get into our categories. The full article identifies 8 different categories, but the last category is kind of a hypothetical considering what might come next with the group that are currently coming of age. And the first one are people who realistically have no experience of video games in their youth. They were born well before this was even considered a medium, so we're going to go ahead and skip those. And we're starting about 1960. I have to figure that if you were born before that, then at the very best, video games didn't exist until you were into young adulthood, so this was simply not a normal medium for you, so this article doesn't really apply to you. It doesn't really cover you. The first category I want to look at are people born roughly between 1960 to 1973, so we're looking at people who are now into upper adulthood, approaching older age, and this is going to be our arcade generation. These are the people who came of age, who most likely the first thing they remember of video games was during the golden age of arcades. Now, this group, it's always important to remember when talking about arcades, is that this is a group for whom video games had a distinctive geography. During the period where this cohort was growing up, arcades were everywhere. There was this massive explosion. People can kind of underestimate how large this sort of nascent video game industry was in the 70s. These things got really big really quick. So this is kind of the first group for whom it's safe to assume that they have played video games at some point in their lives, in some context. You really can't assume that about people who came before. But Their understanding of video games, again, fixed to a specific geography, fixed to time and place, they're more likely to think of this as something of a casual hobby. Being a really hardcore video game enthusiast back during this period could get fairly expensive. Yeah, you didn't need to buy your own hardware, but you need a lot of quarters. So this was sort of a casual activity. A lot of people participated in it, but many people didn't participate in it as sort of a dedicated hobby. So this is a group that would have existed before the concept of the quote-unquote gamer really existed, and they would have just thought of this as another pastime. We now move into the era that was dominated by the consoles, and this is a period I have split into two, starting with people who have more or less most people who have a 70s birthday. And this is sort of the early console era, and it is a very interesting period for a couple of reasons. First of all, the entire industry is in flux because arcades are still booming, but now you're starting to get the ability to play video games at home. Also, this is a cohort that would have experienced both what I would argue is both the high point of the industry and the low point of the industry. They saw the golden age, they saw Atari really break out, and then they saw Atari die, and then they saw the arcades shrink. So this is a group where their understanding of video games, they kind of came of age where they almost certainly played games, much like the group before them, but they probably didn't keep playing games. This was a group where by the time they had reached adulthood, adults had abandoned the video game market. Remember, back in the 70s, everybody played video games. You know, moving to the 80s, it's still true. Pac-Mania is going strong. Everybody's into video games. Then we get to 1983 and the fall of Atari, and then the year after that, there's a big crunch in the arcades. And when the economics change, the culture goes along with it, and a lot of the adult audience for these games really abandons them. So a lot of the people born in this era, although they probably played video games as well, they probably didn't keep going. This is a group that would have really been one of the first groups to think of video games as a hobby for children, because within their lifetimes, that was true. And now we advance into the second half of our console dominant period. These are mostly people with 80s birthdays, so I'm going to be in this group. And these are the people for whom video games, growing up at least, video games were on consoles. So we have this really serious change in the geography. Arcades still exist. I mean, I can talk a lot more about this because this is me. Arcades still existed. They were still part of the culture. They were all over the place. But that wasn't necessarily, unless you were into fighting games, it was kind of a different thing. That's not really where you went to play video games. You were doing them in your bedroom, in your living room, in your friend's living room, something like that. It's a major change in the geography. We also get the first kind of serious handhelds during this period, and I have a whole article on that, which we won't go into. But this is really the period, and I've identified this as the console wars period, because the kids who grew up in this period absolutely remember Nintendo versus Sega. That was the big contest. This was an era of mascots. This was an era of video game mascots being really big. And I don't know if you've ever noticed this about mascots. Everyone compares them to Mickey Mouse. All I heard growing up was more kids recognize Mario than Mickey Mouse. Is that true? I don't know, but everybody was saying it. So what happened during this period? Well, we get the refinement of genres, kind of what we consider the standard video game genres today. They come from this period. Arcades had sort of a different set of genres insofar as they even had them. This was a big hardware period. There were a lot of changes. We were kind of starting to get the standardization of the console generation here. But this was also a big cultural shift. Really, most of these eras are defined by technology, but it's the culture that always interests me the most. And there are a few interesting things going on here. The biggest one being there is a gigantic rift in this period between this generation and their parents. I make a joke in the article that's not really a joke about this being the era of confused parents walking into Toys R Us because their kid wants a Genesis and asking for a Sega Nintendo. Ask anyone who worked in a toy store during this period, they will tell you this happened a lot. This was really, I think, the widest gap between this generation, this group, this cohort, and their parents on this, because this really was an era where video games were for pre-adolescent boys. I can tell you from personal experience during this period, if you were over 15 or 16 years old and playing video games, it was seen as a little bit shameful. It was seen as very immature. This was a period where video games belonged to the kids. And as a result, those of us who grew up through this era, as a result of that, and also the massive controversy, because the 90s, this would have been our kind of 90s kids, and they would have remembered all of the congressional hearings about video game violence, were a little bit protective. We're a little bit defensive about the hobby. And we are more likely to identify as quote-unquote gamers because back in the day, you did. There were kids who played video games and there were kids who did not. And there was a pretty hard cleft between those two. And that's kind of our experience. And we've carried that through well into adulthood. A lot of people have maybe clung to it a little bit too tightly, I think. We now move on to our mostly 90s birthdays. This is going to be our Y2K generation. And of course, the big shift here has to do with the internet. This is the first generation that grew up after the World Wide Web was standard, after you started to see a lot more DSL, more high-speed internet, more people had the internet. I certainly remember, think of it as, I remember when we got the internet in my tiny rural town, horrible dial-up. I remember that. The kids in this category, the people in this category, because they're adults now, probably don't. They came of age in a period where the internet was standard, and that applied to video games too. Online games were standard for the ones born a little later, things like downloadable games and DLC. That was standard too. This was an era of MMORPG domination. This was an era where you were kind of starting to see the roots of competitive games, kind of proto esports during this era. I can definitely remember things like that. You were starting to see sort of your competitive video game celebrities. More than that, though, this was an era of massive technological change. I've always kind of asserted, I've made this argument in different forums, that I think the fifth generation, the fifth console generation, represented the biggest technological leap. It just had the most changes going on compared to any others. There was just a lot of shifts going on to this period. Culturally, this was a lot less controversial. There was a lot less video game controversy in the 2000s. There was some, but not nearly as much as there was in the 90s, certainly. Hollywood. I have to mention this because this was when we saw the Tomb Raider and Resident Evil cinematic franchises start up. I know that this was ancient history in terms of cinematic culture and video game culture for that matter, but in their era, these were huge franchises for film. And so this was a period where you were starting to see video games get mainstream. This was the beginning. It was during this era that the average age of the console owner passed 20. It was closer to 30 by the end of it. And yeah, a lot of people throughout this era, throughout the 2000s, still thought of video games as a hobby for children, but it was fewer and fewer of them. And those people, it was really kind of easy to see them as a bunch of old freaks. So what you look at with this generation is sort of, a lot of it has to do with the games they are playing, which is a big part of this project. What games are people into? You know, for people my age, it's a fairly wide variety because when we were kids, there was a gigantic range of games being made. But throughout the 2000s, this was kind of winnowed down. This was when you started to see FPS domination. This is when you started to see a lot of things like old school RPGs and adventure games go away. And it was also a period where video games were becoming more competitive. One definite characteristic, I think, of people my age is that we came of age during a period where video games were arguably at their least social. It was an era, people sometimes defend this, oh, you go over to your friend's house, so it's actually more social than now. That was an option. It was an option to go over to your friend's house. It was also an option to do what I did and to sit in my room with the door closed playing Final Fantasy VI for 5 hours without stopping. That was a choice too. But as things started to migrate online, you're seeing video games in general starting to take on a more competitive and to a lesser extent collaborative element. So if the people my age are kind of video games at its most solitary, this cohort is where they start to become a lot more massive. We now move into our current young adults, mostly people with a 2000s birthday. We have some of the late 90s in here for our crossover period. And this is our 17 to 29-year-old demographic, and here we are looking at our mobile generation. This is the first group who probably were exposed to video games on a parent's phone. And needless to say, this was a big change. With mobile, you start to see new monetization systems, although we'll get into that in the next group. You'll start to see new genres. I think people underestimate that the mobile market has its own genres that are not quite the same as either console or PC. And so there's a lot of shifting during this period. I don't want to focus too much on mobile because there's really a couple things going on here. In addition to the mobile market really growing out here, in addition to things like the App Store and the widespread adoption of smartphones, this is also the period where the PC market is really booming. You know, when I was a kid, PC gaming was niche. It was a very small thing compared to the consoles. For the cohort after mine, it's growing, but this is a period where you're seeing, for example, Steam launches and turns into a store. Initially, it had been more of a matchmaking service, but by this point, it's a shop. So we're kind of into the indie period. So this is the era that I would normally cover on this channel. So PC is booming. On the consoles, this is the dawn of these mega franchises. In the article, I say that the kids in this cohort are our first Call of Duty babies. These are the kids born into a Call of Duty world. Whether or not they embrace that depends, because the thing about this group is it's very hard for me to say that they've all had the same experience. I think this is the fuzziest one. I really see this split in two. On the one hand, you have people who are kind of more into that quote-unquote hardcore kind of style, which are going to be probably more male. They're going to be a little bit older. They're going to be on the older end of this, with those kind of like late 90s, early aughts birth dates, and they're going to have more exposure to consoles, and those are going to be maybe the most competitive group you encounter. These are going to be people who are kind of raised on esports, and they're really into that. The other group, who are a little bit younger, who are maybe a little bit more female, less console exposure, they're going to be a little bit more on the casual side. So kind of depending on where you were born during this period and what you saw growing up, you may be closer to the cohort before this, or you may be closer to the one after this. This is one of the more complex ones, and I don't think there's a really simple archetype you can apply to everyone born in this period. It's complex for all of these. There's always going to be outliers and exceptions, but in this case, it's a lot of exceptions. This then brings us to the kids these days. This is a category, our birth dates I've identified for this are 07 to 2016. So this is going to be mostly high school and down for this category. And I've identified this as the live service era, because realistically, if you were born in this period, the ideas that we used to have of video games as being these discrete products that get released on a nice steady release schedule, where every month you're getting a magazine, or you're seeing a website that's going to have some kind of updates for it, or you're watching videos that have some kind of updates, that has all changed. What you have in this era is the video game industry really coalescing first around this new economic model, this kind of modified version of the freemium model that had been around in mobile for a while and in a lot of smaller online games for years before that, but also just around an ever smaller number of games. I've talked about this in a few other contexts before. A lot of the youngest cohort that we really know about right now, they tend to think of video games in terms of video game. They play video game. They have one game. It's probably a game all their friends at school are playing, and that's kind of what they gravitate towards. And as a result, they are not, so many people who are, in their 30s, 40s, even down to their 20s, are still thinking in terms of all of the new games that come out every month. And for this group, that is not how they think. This is more than anything, a group that is highly unlikely to identify as quote-unquote gamers. They just don't think of it in those terms. But they're also just a lot less hardcore. Now, Another thing that happened during this period is controversy came back into video games. Very different controversy during this period. It's, of course, not based around violence. It's increasingly focusing more on monetization and the negative effects that has. You've seen, I'm sure, hundreds of videos on the topic, read hundreds of articles. You don't need me to go any further into it. But this is a pretty significant shift. And so what you have is a youth generation that are maybe not as emotionally connected to video games writ large as the older cohorts are. You know, these are people, I think, in many ways, they have more in common with that first group we talked about, with the arcade generation, where, yeah, they enjoy video games. They may even play them a lot. They also consume a lot of video game related media. That's a big thing for this cohort and the one before them. It's a big dividing line. And yet, they're not really committed. My thought has always been that the people this age eventually are just going to age out. I don't think they're going to shoot. When they switch, they tend to switch the one game they play. They tend to switch to another game that looks like it. But I've always kind of thought that it's going to get to a point where they start to drop out of the market because they're just not as committed to video games as a whole. There's one game they like, and when they get tired of it, they go do something else. And that is the biggest difference between them and the groups that came before them, I think. So there's our list. If you want something a little more coherent, a little more focused, I will have a link to the full article down in the description. I highly recommend reading that. This was just me rambling a little bit while I work on the article. But if you have any thoughts at all, if you feel that there was something I left out, if you feel that you really fit these archetypes or that you really didn't, I highly encourage you to drop a comment and join in the conversation.